Christina Evans. I'm the CEO of JABA, and I want to welcome you all to Embrace Every Season. We're so glad that you're able to be here with us today. This event is about recognizing the different seasons of life, especially the ones that come with caregiving, change, and transition. Each season brings its own challenges, but also moments of connection, growth, and meaning. Today we hope you feel supported, seen, and reminded that you are not navigating these experiences alone. I'd also like to take a moment to share a little about JABA, Jefferson Area Board for Aging. It's a nonprofit area on aging services for adults 60 above, adults with disabilities, caregivers, and community members of all income levels in Central Virginia for more than 50 years. By offering a wide variety of innovative programs and services for those their aging journey, JABA empowers greater independence, promotes healthy aging, fosters a sense of dignity and fulfillment for all, and celebrates the contributions that older adults invest in our communities. Before we continue, again, I want to thank you all for being here, for supporting JABA, and for being part of this conversation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Melissa Alemán, the Graduate Director of Communication and Advocacy Master's Program at JMU University. Dr. Alemán research explores communication and identity in a variety of contexts, including caregiving and end-of-life communications in later life families, narratives, and material culture and multicultural families. And this communication of culture in a variety of higher education contexts. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alemán.
I came to the study of communication and aging over 30 years ago as a doctoral student in the Midwest at the University of Iowa, where I did my field work at a retirement community in Chicago, in the north side of Chicago. And during that 3-year period of volunteering and interacting in an independent living facility in the north side of Chicago, I learned a lot from the stories of the residents there. And also I even spent a 6-month gig as a activities director at a low-income retirement community in the south of Chicago. Most of my early work on communication and aging was on community dynamics in independent living communities, as well as long-term marriage. So I studied a lot on couples who have been married for 50 years or longer. I came to the study of caregiving about 15 to 16 years ago. And how I did that was through doing collaborative work with my now retired mom. My mom was a professor of psychology and a family therapist. And like much of what I study and teach, I came to the study of caregiving because caregiving became a central feature in our family life. We were in the throes of caregiving for older generations. And that really sparked this interest of mine. I'll be sharing some of my stories of caregiving in our family a little bit later on in the talk today. To get us started, I want to start by sharing 2 passages of caregiving, about caregiving, to help us think or sort of see or brew over this topic. The first one is by Gail Sheeny in her work, Passages of Caregiving. And she writes, caregiving may well be one of the most important passages of your life. How you handle this crisis will shape how you feel about yourself and almost change you in ways that follow you to the end of your days. The second passage I want us to think about is a more recent one by Kate Washington in her book, Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America. And she writes, not knowing what lies ahead, living with the dread of loss, unable to attend to one's basic needs because of the urgency of another person's, those are aspects of caregiving that can't be conveyed by all the statistics in the world. Although I'll point to a handful of statistics today, that is not the focus of our time here. Our focus is on the value of family stories and family stories about storytelling about caregiving. And I want to start us off by having us think about what is conveyed to us through family stories of caregiving. and I have this nice little metaphor up here. I want us to think about family stories of caregiving as seeds. Okay, they're seeds for the tellers, they're seeds for the listeners of these stories, and they're seeds for the whole family system. When we tell such stories in our family, we do three essential things. We plant family ideals and values about caregiving. We normalize conversations about end of life and caregiving and dying. And we make visible labor that is often invisible. And that's really important. And I want to talk to you about these three essential features. So thinking kind of let's first by talking about stories as seeds that plant ideals and wishes for caregiving. And this is really how I came to the study of caregiving, is thinking around this topic. In her book, Black Sheep and Kissing Cousins, Elizabeth Stone writes that our family stories tell us what matters in family and instruct us on how we are to be with one another, particularly in difficult times. Not only do we learn about how to be a family caregiver, how to be ill ourselves, and how to face death, but family stories are also ways for us to reconstruct and remember our past experiences. They're a way, in our telling, we remember these things. And they also provide a way for us to look to the future. They give us a sense of knowing about what to expect and what lies ahead. And that's really important. And so in this way, our family stories are like what Bud Goodall calls, quote, narrative inheritance. When we think of the word inheritance, we think about things, right? We think about lockets and pie chests and china that are passed down. But we also pass down our stories, right? We exist as in the stories that our forebears tell us about our family. So we have this very rich and narrative inheritance. I've co-authored a number of papers with my mom about this very topic. My mom and I started noticing how much we shared stories of caregiving about the matriarchs in our family in particular. And we realized that these stories we were telling together offered us a lot of lessons about our expectations for what it means to be a caregiver and what it means to give care in our family. From poignant stories of cognitive decline, all the women in my family have spent their final days with Alzheimer's, to humorous stories and points of joy, they all offered us up an inheritance of expectations for care, that we will show up, and that not all care looks the same. And this is really important. There's not a single idea of what caregiving should look like. For example, my great aunt Dina spent her final year with terminal cancer in our home, as in my childhood home, and died in our living room in a hospital bed. Both of my grandmothers spent their final years in memory care after long care in their home by family members. My mother-in-law, who recently passed away after a long illness, spent over a year with 24/7 care by my 7 sister-in-laws and our nieces. 24/7 care, right? In her home, she passed away in her home. Care does not look the same for all families and in all instances. Whether at home or with the supportive community of caregivers and assisted living and nursing care, our stories tell us much about what our family expects of us. I'd like to share a story from over 15 years ago when I was regularly going back and forth from Virginia to Maryland to help my grandfather with the care of my grandmother. I was also returning to be a source of support to him as a caregiver, a sole caregiver for her. In the story, I'm visiting my grandparents so that my granddad could go out and run errands by himself. And I would often do that. I would go with him so he could go to the doctor or to even to shop. So the story starts with, covertly, my grandfather leaves me with a laundry list of suggestions for keeping my grandma calm while he's out running errands. Melissa, just lie down on the bed next to your grandmother. Pretend you really want to watch a program and turn on the television in the bedroom. He quickly sneaks into our conversation. Maybe she'll sleep while I'm gone. I must look a little doubtful. Grandma's shrinking body is next to mine on my grandparents' bed, clearly awake, but now agitated, worried about disturbing my rest. My body feels trapped in the deep indentation left in the mattress from my granddad's persistent attempts to either get her to nap or to find space alone in the house. Grandma keeps looking over at me. I feel her eyes darting from the ceiling to me. I pretend to sleep, hoping she too will drift into rest. Then I feel the bed move slightly, thinking Grandma's only shifted. Her small body barely impacts the mattress, but then I feel her softly placing a blanket over me. I don't want you to get cold, honey, she whispers as she tries to cover me with her feet, with the blanket. I feel guilty, but comforted too. Maybe caring for me orients her. She spent most of her retired life juggling her second career with being the fun grandmother. Growing up, she was the kind of grandmother children delight in, swimming with us in the lake, taking us on our first whitewater rafting trip, teaching us to paint, making jam from wild blackberries picked in the mountain roads near their house nestled next to the Appalachian Trail, and spinning tales of her adventurous youth. Her one oft-repeated story, although shortened each time we visited, was launched with, "Remember, I used to be a pilot. Your grandmother flew airplanes." Looking like Katharine Hepburn waiting for Howard Hughes, a picture, I wish I would have it up here, a picture of her in her early 20s next to her small airplane rests in my office at school, inspiring me to seek my own adventures, even if they are not the sort that she had in mind for me. I would not be flying in Artemis. Because then she would say, you know, I would have been an astronaut if I would have lived in your time. You're missing out. Later, her certain pilot story concluded with, that must have been about 10 or 20 years ago. We never corrected her. Instead, we'd imagined that she'd tell it again, even if it was an hour later. My memories in this moment quickly disintegrate as I follow my grandma with my eyes as she moves to the living room and starts to pace. I quickly toss the blanket aside, roll off the bed and follow her, throwing myself sloppily on the couch as she paces from shuffling from the living room to the front door, back and forth. This story of a small but relatively routine caregiving interaction with my grandmother shows us the complexity of caregiving. It is not one way. In it, we relive multiple memories of our past relationships. The telling of the story can also affirm the ideals our family holds of care and of showing up for one another in both big and small ways. It's really important, though, to note that our stories can show conflicts in family expectations for care. My grandfather was adamant about not receiving outside support from my grandmother's care, and this came in direct conflict with his children and grandchildren, who regularly tried to intervene to provide him with support and to help him recognize that grandma needed more care than he or we could provide. And in retelling these stories, we begin to see that conflict and recognize that is something that is present in our families. We just are not always on the same page. And living in those stories can help us to negotiate that. The second thing I want to talk about, or this leads me to another essential feature of family stories of caregiving, and that is, in those stories, we normalize talk about caregiving and death and dying in our family. When we share stories, so that the topic is not the unspoken elephant in the room. It's really important that we bring this up. In my own classrooms, I talk to my students about the importance of talking about grief, about the importance of talking about end-of-life conversations, about talking about caregiving so that it isn't so scary, right? That it's part of our lives. And about a decade ago, my mom and I were writing a book chapter on this very topic. We were writing on mother-daughter conversations about end-of-life wishes, death and dying. And so we did most of our work As a faculty member, I have a lot of flexibility in the summer, and I spent a good portion of the summer with her at her house in Delaware. During months when my then college-age son, he's now 28, was living and working there to work at the beach, right? And then my uncle, my mom's single brother, was coming in and out. So we would regularly start our days sort of sitting with coffee at the table and start sharing remembrances of our grandparents, my grandparents' end of life. And we had very vivid stories from different perspectives. We also talked about our own visions for ourselves and our own care, and often funny and frustrating experiences that we had around care and family. And one of the things that we started to notice is that my son was listening as he walked in and out of the room, getting ready for work, and chiming in. He started chiming in with his own observations, even though he was not present. The stories we were talking about were stories from long before he was born. And he's not freaked out, right, by conversations around death and dying, or conversations around my mom's declining health as beloved grandmother, or even conversations about my husband and myself and our own health issues. Our son has learned that this is just another thing we talk about in families. When you're around stories of caregiving, end of life, and dying, they reduce uncertainty of family members and they become less taboo. Right? We have a lot of cultural taboos around talking about our own mortality and our family members' mortality and our own grief. And just telling stories becomes a soft landing place to begin to have those conversations. My uncle, who was my mom's single brother, who was often really reticent to share anything, was a guarded person, right? Sat down one day with my mom and I, and as we were sharing stories, and he was like, all this talk you're doing about caregiving and mom and dad's death has me thinking, maybe I should give some thought to that, about what I want and what I think is important. We were dumbstruck. We were like, wow, this thing that we're sort of theorizing actually is kind of playing out with our most reticent family member. Now, 10 years later, I am my uncle's caregiver, and I know what his wishes are. Right? And part of that happened through this project that my mom and I started doing, and started thinking more intentionally about telling these stories in, I don't know, living room, right? And so it makes us more comfortable around them. Lastly, for this first part of my talk, I want us to think about how stories make often invisible care work visible. This is so important. According to Allport, and I said I would do a few statistics. According to Allport and Wample, almost 30% of the U.S. population serves as a caregiver to a family member who is sick, disabled, or elderly. This is why we're here, right? To support every caregiver. 30%, that is a huge percentage of the U.S. population, right? According to the AARP, most of those caregivers are midlife or older adults themselves. Family caregivers, by definition, are unpaid and typically do not have specialized skill sets related to that care. It's not surprising that family caregivers have significant levels of stress and also negative impacts on physical and mental health. We need to figure out how to intervene in those places, and that's one of the great things about JABA, right? Family caregivers are often juggling multiple responsibilities, including their own children, and maybe even providing support for a spouse and elderly parents at the same time. I have a colleague that's in that situation. They find themselves stretched to the breaking point, running from work to doctor's appointments to after-school pickup for kids, and then back to drop by the assisted living facility or relieve a sibling at a parent's house. When I joined my husband in California shortly after my mother-in-law passed away, we began to circle around my 7 sister-in-laws who provided round-the-clock care for her for over a year. You know, notice the kind of gendered element is that as well. And the stories centered around how we navigated that work. And listening to their stories of care, coordinating care, negotiating transitions, scary moments when they didn't know what to do, dispensing medications, dealing with medical bills, confronting my mother-in-law's resistance to morphine at the end, these stories recognize their labor in all its messiness, complicated frustrations, resentment, fear, and love, right? It's a messy game, but we sat with those stories. We honor caregiver labor when we make space to listen. And whatever form that is. And this is going to lead me to a bit of a twisty turn in my talk. I've been talking about stories, and now I want to talk about storytelling as an action. And bear with the professor and me here to make this distinction. Okay? So while the content of stories give us lessons about caregiving, the action of storytelling is something we do together, right? So what we were talking about before is listening to what's in the stories. Now I want to talk about why it matters that we do this activity together, that it's something that we do. It's in the telling that really matters. So I want you to think about how stories are told in your families. Who are the storytellers? How do people listen to stories? What does it look like to tell a story jointly, where each person adds to the memory and the action unfolding? How are questions asked in the telling? Conversations opened? Conflicts of memory and history resolved or heightened? This is me and my dad. We have two different memories of the same experience, right? But through joint storytelling, we figure that out together, right? All of this happens in the telling itself. So I'd like us to turn to thinking about communication in this way. The action of storytelling together in families. And to really think about what it means to embrace that activity. It's an ask, it's a big ask of us, right? And so we're going to see some overlaps a little bit. One of the first things that is really important about the act of storytelling together in families is that storytelling, and the literature across the board tells us this, storytelling helps us make sense of chaotic and difficult experiences. When we're uncertain, we try to make meaning of what's happening by telling a story. And doing so together creates a family narrative and a family understanding of that experience. And this is particularly the case when families are trying to make sense of a difficult diagnosis such as dementia, right, which is something that it happens in my family. When a family member is diagnosed with dementia, whether it's Alzheimer's disease or other related forms of cognitive impairment, it can create upheaval for both the individual and the family member. It's what we call a biographical disruption. We weren't expecting it. Our identity has to shift in some way, right? Telling stories, or storytelling about the experiences around illness, doctor's appointment, and caregiving can really help families make sense of that uncertainty. And I want to tell kind of a story. In my own family, when my mom was my maternal grandmother's, and you're probably looking around all my grandmothers, was my maternal grandmother's caregiver for the last several years of her life. And before she moved to memory care, my mom drove her, was her driver, and drove her many appointments. And so we told a lot of stories in our family together about how she was negotiating that caregiving experience. And I want to share one that she wrote as part of her own work that showcased kind of the layers of realizations that we have when we say things out loud with one another. And so my mom writes, leaving the doctor's office, she's taking my grandmother from an appointment. We merged onto the heavily trafficked Little River Parkway and inched along with all the noonday cars. Sue sat quietly in the front passenger seat, holding her tiny body tightly together, as if she needed to take up the smallest amount of space possible. She wore multiple rings on her fingers, twirled the rings on her right fingers with her trembling left hand. Watching out the passenger window, she announced the street signs as we slowly passed by. After announcing the latest road sign, she turned to me and asked, Kathy, "Do you know where we're going?" I responded, "Yes, Mom, I do." I began to tell her exactly where we are and where we will turn next. Still twisting her ring, Sue is not satisfied. "Do you know where we are?" she interrupts. I nod and quietly say, "Mm-hmm." Sue persists in her inquiry after announcing yet another road sign. "Are you sure we're not lost?" Trying not to show my frustration with what seems like an endless questioning of my confidence, as she was known to do even prior to the onset of dementia, I say, "No, I know where we are, you'll see." I know that my mother is only projecting her own worries and feelings of disorientation on me. She confirms this as she whispers in a shaky voice, "I don't, I'm lost." Not 5 minutes pass before this interaction is repeated. In the throes of caregiving, my mom and I in particular would tell these small stories, building off each other, to build on an understanding of what was happening in our family, my grandmother's feelings, our own feelings of her identity shifting, and how we were making sense of past relationships and newly formed relationships in the present. And so they were really informing our framework for making sense of family. Now, I talked a little bit about this when I was talking about stories normalizing end-of-life conversations, but I want us to think about storytelling with family as a moment that's sparking a moment of opportunity to engage in tough conversations. Talking about caregiving and end-of-life wishes doesn't and probably shouldn't be a one-time sit-down with a family member. It's something that happens progressively over time, and is malleable as our life circumstances change. These small stories and conversations can set the stage for wishes being expressed. And thinking about what this happened, before I came today, I was talking with a colleague who's a death doula here in Charlottesville, and we were talking about how difficult it is for us to talk about our own mortality and the mortality of those that we love. And storytelling together can become a mechanism to create an opening, right? So you're not necessarily continuing to storytell, but you've started that process, and that is a window so that you can then ask questions. What matters to you? Right? What matters most to you when you are in your final months? What environment would you like to live in at the end of life? Tell me more about what your parents' last years were like. These are not single moments, but small storytelling over time in which we want to be open to things changing. I noticed that in my own family storytelling, that because we're telling stories, we are open to the dynamics of wishes also changing and needs changing as family diagnosis happens, right? That they're not static. So something that my mother might have told me 10 years ago about what she wishes for her care, I saw it last night in a conversation. It looks different, right? And we need to keep telling stories together to create these openings to these really tough conversations. And in that way, as I mentioned before, it helps to normalize it. So telling stories about end of life and caregiving can help normalize this very human experience. Before I was talking, in the earlier part of my talk, I talked about normalizing conversations. Now I want to talk a little bit about just normalizing and getting comfortable with the fact that we're all going to die, right? And that telling these stories helps us sit into anticipated loss and anticipated grief that we often do in our families when our families are sick or when they are aging. And I want to tell you a story that also normalizes the complex and charged experiences of caregiving for a family member in later life when family members aren't on the same page. And to provide some context, like many families, my family is spread out across many states. As I mentioned, my husband's family's in California. Making later life decisions really difficult and fraught. Right? After my grandfather died, my father had power of attorney and guardianship for my grandmother. He was charged with decisions about her care and finances. He lives 1,200 miles away in Minnesota. And so I'm going to start with a memory, that's the context. I'm going to start with a memory of a photo. This is a hard story for me. A photo of my grandmother's hands, and I'm not sure why I took it, but I'm really glad that I did. This is the last photo I took of my grandmother before she died 4 days later. Just a few days prior, she started receiving hospice care, not because of any particular illness, but because her body seemed to be systematically shutting down. She had a bad fall and broke her hip 6 months earlier, which had signaled the end for all the other matriarchs in my family. But she rallied, went through rehab, and for a short time resumed her life in memory care. My father and uncle and her sons both lived thousands of miles away in Minnesota and up to Mata. My sister and I both lived 2 hours away from her home. And I learned of the hospice decision on Tuesday and volunteered to drive up every Friday, my non-teaching day, miss our faculty meetings, and spend the days sitting with her and checking in with her caregivers. And my sister would come as she was able on the weekends. So that day I arrived at Edenton, which was the community in which she lived, mid-morning, rang the bell to the locked front doors of the memory care building, waved hello to the CNA staff, and walked down the hall in my grandmother's room. The door was ajar. She was sound asleep in her bed with the TV blaring in the background, apparently playing Marathon Law and Order SUV. I was like, no. Nothing like murder, sexual assault, and mayhem round the clock to create a calming environment. How do I change the channel? There has to be a reason this is on. After what feels like forever, and you know that moment when you can't get anything to work. I'm like ready to pull the plug out of the wall. Does it really have to be this difficult? I head over to the desk, asked for help. I get a very calm response, helping me deal with this technical issue. My grandmother remained asleep through all of this. So I took another look around the room, taking stock of the scene. I noticed a large notebook called Hospice on the title. And I opened to read the daily notes of the hospice volunteers over the past few days. I sat down next to my grandmother, the volunteer diary in my hand, and penned a note back to those who will read it. I wrote thank yous for their loving care of my grandmother, and let them know I'd be there on Fridays, and would share my observations too. This is what I remember. I actually don't know if I did that note in the morning or in the afternoon. What I do remember is reaching over at this point and taking my grandmother's hand. In her early days, my grandmother had a heightened concern about her appearance. Parents really mattered to actually both my grandmothers. So I brought lotion, a nail polish remover, quick dry nail polish. So I planned to give her a manicure while we sat. And after a long while of sitting and talking with her, I pulled my supplies out, gently cleaned her nails, massaged lotion on her hands, and polished her nails. A week later at her funeral, I looked down at her hands with my sister, thinking that they would have given her new polish, only to notice that the same polish I had given her nails a week earlier. Such a simple but powerful memory, her hands. Prior to my grandfather's death nearly 4 years earlier, he was the primary caregiver, often covering for her quite obvious progressive dementia. And I was the person with whom he engendered the most trust about her care and his wishes for her care. He was adamant she is to be cared for at home. People go to nursing homes to die. He would often say they are depressing. When he was diagnosed with lung cancer, he faced a shocking rapid decline, was hospitalized, and moved to nursing care. And he agreed it made sense to move her into assisted living in the same location where he was receiving care. During one of the final visits with my grandfather before he died, he grabbed my hand tightly as I was leaving to head home for the evening. Make sure you take care of your grandmother. Holding back tears, I assured him, I will, I love you, Granddad. I kissed him on his head, holding everything back, and quickly walked out of the room in the hallway. As soon as I left the room, my chest was heaving with uncontrollable sobs. My dad put his hand on my shoulder to comfort me. That was unfair of him. He shouldn't have put that on you. My dad had a complicated and sometimes painful relationship with my grandparents. I did not. Truth be told, I was the favorite, if not the favorite. But I didn't have much to say in the decision-making around her care. I was a thorn, and my protest generated defensiveness and stonewalling. Early on, my dad and uncle talked around all the possible scenarios of bringing my grandmother out to live with them, near one of them, only to justify her room in place. Her taxes are complicated, they said. We need to be able to bury her next to Dad, they said. How will we transfer her body back to Maryland, they said. Can you imagine a cross-country drive with your grandmother, they said. right? And I only kind of share this, right, to kind of point to the push and pull that even in our stories of care, in our advocacy, right, that we have to negotiate all kinds of institutional forces at hand and different layers, right? So I'm the power of attorney for my uncle, right? And so I'm in the sense a decision making for him. My father had that role for my grandmother, and so these points of tension can really create conflict in families. And telling stories together about them, it may not change the course of what happens in that family, but what it does, it can resolve and sort of reframe the memory of those experiences. So sharing these stories, and I want to share a bit of that story with you today, is a kind of story that I might share with my sister as we talk through and make sense of the conflicts we have in my grandmother's cares, and basically saying these are not the conflicts we want to have in my mother's care, right? So these stories help us to sort of think through together how we might want to not have these conflicts in the future. This is kind of tied with this. When we tell storytelling together, it can help us facilitate difficult situations and facilitate healing. So most of the research in my field on storytelling really leans into the idea that joint storytelling in families is therapeutic. My colleagues Jody Koenig-Callis and Abel Trees talk about, right, that the way that storytelling can help can help to facilitate grief, it can help to facilitate difficult diagnoses, illness, it can help to facilitate, even in the context of care, divorce, right? All of these kind of major turning points in our family, storytelling together can be a way that we can heal together. So sharing that story of my last interaction with my grandmother and sister is really helpful for navigating how I make sense of caregiving in the past and in the future. I just don't learn from that experience, but we learn together, right, from talking about that. And this is really important. And so I invite you to think about all the different ways that you do storytelling with your family. At the dinner table, that's our big storytelling place. Over the phone, in the coffee shop, even over texts or memes, depending on what generation you're in, right? While on the go or at work, right? My mom, my sister, and I have a FaceTime call almost every evening. These calls usually last about 15 minutes, sometimes longer. They're routine check-ins to connect. They include small stories about what happened during the day, complaints about work or the state of the world, and our health. We often discuss really serious topics in these 15 minutes, though. Sometimes they go a little bit longer. My stepfather's recent cancer diagnosis, my mom's recent diagnosis of moderate cognitive impairment and what that means to her, caregiving concerns I have regarding my uncle, my mom's brother, and recent trips to the doctors. These conversations, and I really want to recognize this, are an important form of long-distance caregiving that characterizes so many of our families. In my own work with my colleagues across the nation, the globe really, the challenges of long-distance and transnational care is very real. We saw that in my family, as we are a bi-coastal family, right? And using technology is often a really important way to do care work, right? It's not the physical labor of caregiving that folks are doing on the ground, but it's important care work nonetheless. And using these digital technologies kind of help us to assess our family needs in the moment. Do we need to hop in the car or hop in a plane to get there in person? And in each of these joint storytelling situations, we're all helping one another understand what's happening, giving words to an experience, expressing both shared and conflicting emotion, right? And communicating empathy. And in this way, joint storytelling can contribute to positive impacts for caregivers, right? And can be identity affirming. And this is really an important aspect of storytelling. It can help us shape future decisions about our own care wishes as caregivers. It can also challenge our existing beliefs and stigmas of aging, illness, hospice, among others. So the literature shows this. Emily Rose and colleagues recently said that caregivers' narratives about themselves can enhance their own life planning, clarify their own end-of-life wishes, and increase their own feelings of self-efficacy, that is, that they can do something about future caregiving. That's pretty powerful stuff, right? When you are telling stories with families, that it clarifies these aspects of fundamental life passages. I'm going to close today having us think about humor and joy. This is my mom. Humor is such an important part of our family stories and our shared laughter and storytelling. So just last night, I have to throw this in, just last night on my nightly call with my mom and my sister, I was reminiscing about one of the last times that my sister and I took my grandmother out to lunch, a relatively lucid moment in which we were talking about her 90th birthday. And my grandmother puts on a sly smile and said, "I think we should do something really dangerous." Quickly followed by a giggle and just joking, as we I like to do. And I recalled this memory over the phone, and we are laughing. And my mom says, of course she would say that. She was such a daredevil. Only someone who got married at 17 on a dare. My mom did. My grandma, I'm glad she did because I'm here. Would say this at 90. What followed was just continued storytelling. We went on this kind of reel of stories about my grandmother. And so to close, I shared this photo of my mom enjoying an ice cream cone. That's our shared love. Because this is an inside joke in our family. But it's humorous and not, right? And what it means to show up at the end of life. And it's one that's grounded in regular joint storytelling with my mom and my sister. Especially, we do this especially when things seem really scary or grim. And because my mom was recently had a diagnosis with cognitive impairment, this story came up just this week. So at the end of my maternal grandmother's life, this is my mom's mom, before she could no longer swallow the end, often the only way to get her to eat was to bring her ice cream. And so every day after work, my mom would stop and get a bowl of soft serve ice cream, not like hard dip ice cream, soft serve ice cream and feed her. And when my mom tells that story, which is very often, and we're participants in that because we've also brought ice cream to her, the punchline is, you don't need to do a lot for me when I'm at the end. Just bring me ice cream. And it's always said with a smile and a giggle, because she and we know that we will and want to be there in so many more ways. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Alemán?
Just a question of, did you have stories of faith at the end too?
Stories of faith?
Yes.
Yes and no, right? The faith in I'm Catholic, and my mom, and as it was my mom is as well. It's kind of a presence, but it hasn't been as embedded as much in our family stories. But one of the things that I have noticed in my studies with long-term married couples is that it has been an important part of making sense of what death and dying means to them and what's coming next. And I think that sort of speaks to the importance of recognizing that our stories are going to shift across cultures, across faith communities, right? As we have different senses of how we make meaning. Most of our family stories center around one another and like what we are doing for and with each other. And part of that comes in communities of support. But that's a great question. Our family stories, not as much, but certainly in my own research, I have seen that as an important part, particularly for long-term married couples. And that when there isn't a shared vision, at end of life, that becomes a source of pain. That was one of the interesting things that I found in my early research. When two members of a couple had different beliefs, that was really difficult. And talking through that was a healing process.
So how do you handle, or do you suggest or encourage one to handle a family member who is highly reticent about having those discussions? Point blank, you should.
How couldn't hear the question?
So the question was, how do you handle a family member who is highly reticent to have those discussions, who like just point blank refuses to participate in those conversations? It's really difficult insofar as you can't make someone talk about something that they're unwilling to talk about. And I think one of the reasons that I like the study of storytelling in particular is it can often like sneak a conversation in the back door. And my uncle's a great example of that because he was that person, right? He was like not talking about it, and he's single, no children, right? We need to decide what's gonna happen long term. And I think you need to start the storytelling really early, because that way you're not thrown off course. Because what the research on caregiving or communication aging in later life is that most often families make decisions, particularly health decisions, in the throes of a crisis, and they think they know what the other person wants, and they really don't. They're just like, I know mom. I know what she wants. No, mom has not told you what she wants, right? And then that's anxiety producing for the caregiver. And so part of it is kind of inviting those or talking around people. That was our pathway with my uncle in particular, was just like, you're just gonna be around us talking about this all the time. And he sort of started to give. But again, you can't make someone have that conversation, but you can create an environment that will spark their opening. And one way is to say, oh, remember when grandma did this? Remember when mom had this experience? And then getting that person involved in whatever that story is. And that's part, you're kind of easing that person into comfort. And so getting them involved in a story that's adjacent to what they need to talk about. And in other ways, though, in instances like that, making sure that other members of the family are having these conversations, right? Because if we layer a reticent potential care recipient down the road with family that don't talk about it, right? Then you have layers and layers of uncertainty. And so what you're doing by having conversations with family members adjacently is you're reducing that uncertainty. So how are we on the same page? What are we going to do to help this situation? That would be my suggestion. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, there is no education for the person, the family member that takes over to care of the loved one. And I remember, like, maybe a day before my mother graduated, that my brother came and he said, has she had her medicine today? And we're like, what? She's not eating. You know what I mean? She was shutting down. She couldn't have possibly swallowed her medicine. And I thought, it's just kind of really sad that there is really no education out there that I've ever found. Because I took care of my mother and then my husband afterwards. So I would say, I think it's the hardest job there ever is.
Yeah, I really appreciate your reflection, and I think if we kind of harken back to the percentage of the U.S. population that is serving in a family caregiving responsibility, and it's untrained, unpaid, right? I don't have the math on me, but when you look at the price tag of that kind of care, and of course we don't put a price tag on our family care, it's enormous, right? And so thinking about like how can communities like the one that we're in today here, how can we lean into caregiver resources? I think, you know, looking to digital resources for care is often a really good source of a good entry point to sort of stories. But yeah, caregivers often feel sort of that uncertainty about, I don't know how to do this. And I know I myself, as someone who is responsible for my uncle, I'm learning on the quick, and I've been studying this for a really long time. But when you find yourself in that situation, you're thinking, I'm not a medical professional, right? How am I paced to make these decisions? Yeah.
To follow that question, I too, when my father was dying, it was challenging not knowing, is this the right amount, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it didn't allow me to feel at ease and just be with the process. Years later now, I'm a doula, and I do the opposite end, and that's something that's available to so many. Hospice of the Piedmont has it. We can have someone come early and walk the journey with you, and the education and the questions that can get answered. So there are resources for those who are dealing with a loved one who's dying.
Thank you so much for saying that. So there's, if I'm correct, there's 30 doulas in this area. I think that's what I was, so that having someone to coach you through is really valuable. Thinking about a kind of a mentor through caregiving. And I think having people to share that experience with you and to answer questions is really valuable. And when that resource is there, to lean into it. And I'm going to kind of I'm going to carry off of that, because another way to kind of enter into these conversations, or difficult conversations we're talking about here, is to go to death cafes and conversations where people are talking about their own mortality and answering and talking about difficult conversations with strangers. Sometimes it's actually easier to talk with people who are strangers first, then you bring it back to the family, right? So looking for those opportunities and looking for those educational events, again, like the one that we're in today, but death doulas are such an important resource.
So I'll just tag team off of that. I'm with Hospice of the Piedmont, and we do, it's not a death cafe, but we have death over donuts, we have death over drafts, we've had art and dine. So trying to bring people together with something that they can connect with. And really what we have found is those conversations are much more easy sometimes with people that you do not know. So I would invite people to, those are all on our website, they're open to anybody. And we'd love for you to join us there, because it really has been a valuable way. It's one conversation, right? And just starting the stories, starting to talk, but it's a step.
Absolutely. And then, and for those that run these events, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there's also some events where you can come to, it's like a death cafe, but you come, they're more with a purpose, like I'm going to draft my kind of end-of-life wishes, and I'm going to draft a practice conversation. I cannot, and this goes back to the question about a reticent person. I'm a big fan of the Conversation Project. I don't know if you all are familiar with that. It's an online resource, conversationproject.org. There are booklets that walk you through how to start thinking about what you want, and that can be really useful for conversation starters for your family, right? And there are questions like, what kind of environment is important to you when you're receiving care? How much do you want to know about your medical needs, right? Some folks, we might think we want agency and autonomy. Sometimes we don't want to know, right? And so you need to decide, how much information do I want to know? Who do I want by my side in my doctor's office, right? These are really important questions, and when you start to answer them for yourself, that can really help you to think about how can you facilitate that conversation with a family member who receives care. So some of these online resources can be really useful. And I love, there's even a book for Alzheimer's and dementia-related caregiving decisions, and so it's how you, at different stages, kind of work through those questions when folks are facing cognitive impairment. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think too that people should know
JABA has caregiver support groups and support group for dementia caregivers. And I think that's really an important way when you're in that, before you, I mean, parallel to end of life decision, but when you're in the moment of how do I deal as a caregiver, caregivers can offer each other support and suggestions, and the facilitator can too, but I think that's an important piece to bring up, and I know it's on the JABA website, but I think as that grows, that provides just camaraderie as well as knowledge.
Absolutely, right. So thinking about social support both inside and outside of the family is so important for caregivers. You know, I kind of rattled off a lot of kind of features, some of the things that we know about caregivers in terms of like declining physical and mental well-being, but we know that communication can provide a really important intervention when you feel supported, when your uncertainty is reduced through conversation with others, when you feel empowered with information, in terms of like having a death doula walk you through that process, then we see a reduction in some of these negative health outcomes for caregivers. And again, like organizations like JABA are really important for kind of intervening into these negative health outcomes, providing information, providing resources, providing spaces like this where you can come together and talk to one another about your own experiences, which may be vastly different, right? I think it's really valuable to actually hear experiences that are quite different. We learn from that. We learn from those stories that we can share with other caregivers. Yeah, thank you. Questions?
If no one else has it, I do. So, the caregiver's guilt.
The caregiver guilt.
Caregiver's guilt.
Yeah.
So, just talk openly about caregiver guilt.
That's a heavy topic.
That's a heavy topic.
The lower one. So you're having to make decisions they don't want for their best interest, for your best interest.
Yeah.
At present, I have him in respite so that I can have one, and that never goes well. It never does. And so where I am now is what sort of long-term decision do I have to make so that I can stay alive for both of us and sane also at the same time. And bear the guilt of it all because I'm a sole caregiver.
Yeah, and I want to first sort of affirm your need for respite. Caregiver respite is so important that we can't carry this on our own, right, without help from others. And we often, I think, as caregivers feel really alone. And I think that speaks to some of the pieces. And I definitely saw that with my grandfather and his care for my grandmother. And part of it was he closed the door to help, and he would have really benefited from respite. So I applaud you. I think that that's really important, that you take care of yourself. It's kind of like the airplane. You need to put your oxygen mask on first, and then you're going to be able to provide care. Rest is so important. I'm also an advocate for rest.
And riffing off of that, setting boundaries with the person you're caring. Any suggestions?
I mean, I think there's different ways that we set boundaries. So, you know, in my case, for example, I'm a caregiver for someone who has a great care team, right? So I'm the person that he can't drive. You know, I take him to his appointments. I'm the person that helps him do his taxes. All those kinds of things, right? It's a lot easier for me to set boundaries, right? It doesn't mean that I'm finding it easy, but right, but he's got care in place. He's going to be he's okay, right? it's harder for caregivers that are balancing, who are the primary caregivers, right? And who are the primary care team and don't have extended support, right? So I think it's really important when we're thinking about questions around that, boundary setting, right, is what does that look like, right? And I think for some of us, boundary setting can be around like privacy, right? That's, in our field, like privacy management is a big one, and when you're a care provider and also a care recipient, like your privacy is also now like kind of blown away, right? And thinking about like how can you have conversations around like, I'm here in the house, but I need some me time, right? And I've got whatever your mechanism is for reaching out here, but I'm reading a book, right? So some of it is actually creating physical space, but some of it is, I think a lot of it is managing private information, right? When you're with someone what feels like 24/7, you don't know where you end and the other person begins. You feel that interdependence, and thinking about sort of ways to navigate that is really tough. But like I said, the context matters, like whether you're navigating a home care situation versus when you're in an institutional environment. Yeah. But caregiver guilt, right? I think, well, I cut one of my stories short because it was going to go on forever. But it's a real thing, right? We have guilt in terms of putting ourselves first. We feel guilt in terms of, did I make the right decision? Right? Was this the right thing to do? Did I say the right thing? Did I include the right members of the care team in this conversation? Did I advocate strongly enough with my other family member who disagrees with me? Guilt takes on so many different features, right? And it's a human experience, right? That's part of that is like talking through that. And I harken back to like what I was saying in my talk. I think it's really important to, if it's not your family to have these conversations with, to have conversations around those feelings with others who can empathize with your experience, who are willing to ask questions and listen, and whether that's a support group, therapist, a friend that you take a walk around the block to get that respite and to get that exercise, having them to talk with you and help you make sense of that, and also to reassure you, like you're doing the best you can, right? Is really important. I'm really lucky because I have a close relationship with my mom and my sisters, and we serve in that capacity. But I also recognize that we're aging, and like I'm gonna need to shift that, right? Who am I talking with? I saw a hand in the back, yeah.
Going off of the lady in the pretty pink over there with the breast. I have been a caretaker to both in-laws, my mom, as well as my sister, which have all passed. And back when I was doing this, I didn't know about respite. So this kind of like all put on my shoulders. And now that I'm working at JABA, I see what respite does for the spouses or the family members that come in. I just wish I knew about it back then when I was doing all of that. And so I believe that things happen for a reason, and I still have one more family member that I'm probably going to have to be caring for sooner rather than, actually two, rather than later. So now I know what's offered out there, and and the guilt and everything. So yeah, respite for yourself. I didn't get it, but I can see how it really, really is important and impactful.
And the resources are going to look different in every community, right? In some communities, you're going to, I think Charlottesville is a good example of that. There's really good resources here, and maybe in other more rural communities, there might not be as many resources. But learning to like figure out how you can sort of build onto networks of support, or like in my maternal grandmother's case, one of the things that allowed us to keep her at home for so long was that and she lived in Fairfax. There was adult daycare, right? So she spent part of the day in a community center, and what it also did, what's really important particularly for cognitive impairment is that you have a lot of social interaction. And so it had a dual benefit. It gave my mom and my uncle respite. They were able to continue working. And it gave my grandmother a lot of really good social interaction. Multi-generational situations where there's kids and folks that are needing care support is also another great place, because children, intergenerational interaction is so facilitative and healing as well. And that's another way to sort of enter respite, is to look for those kinds of resources in the community so that you can have that space. Yeah.
I just wanted to add an anecdote, because I used to work at JABA, so I know some of the stories from our adult day center, which is our JREC, our Respite Enrichment Center. And one gentleman, his wife was in our center every day, and he told me, he said at the end of the day, she comes out bubbling with information and how happy she was and what she did, and the next morning she doesn't remember and she's very upset. But he said knowing how she felt when she got there made it much easier for him to kind of work through the difficult moments, because he knew it was a good experience. So sometimes people with cognitive impairment aren't going to remember that experience, but when they get there. And so I think it's important for caregivers to know that sometimes you do feel very guilty because it feels like you're just forcing someone into something, but when they're in it, they're actually having a really good day. And you see it maybe at the end, but it's hard to remember it the next morning when you're trying to get them to go there. And I think that's true whether it's the adult care center or any number of other things, that sometimes that experience is enhanced, but you don't see it right away that that person is in a good spot.
Absolutely, right? And I think what you're describing too is that dynamic of caregiver guilt and then care recipient uncertainty, right? So a lot of what's being navigated in that situation is, okay, my rational brain knows that they don't remember and that they're uncertain about what they're doing, but this feels really yucky to me right now, but I know that it's going to be really positive. And so it's like Groundhog Day of repeating it over and over again. I'm like, okay, I know this uncertainty is going to happen tomorrow. But it's really positive for me and for them. And I think that's a really good reminder. And part of it is sort of meeting people where they're at as well, and recognizing that okay, here's the pattern, here's the ritual in this moment, and that's the challenge that I'm going to be confronting. How are we going to work through that together? And you get that rhythm.
You spoke about your son. How is your family incorporated with storytelling with really young children?
That's a great question. It's a side note. So my son's an only child, and we're a multicultural family. My husband is Latino, and one of the things that and he's also a professor of communication, my poor kid, so one of the things that we've done and we've talked about and theorized in our own work is, particularly in multicultural families where you might come to expectations around end of life and caregiving with really different sets of values. And that's the case in my family, right? My husband's family ideas about end of life look really different than what my family's end-of-life ideals look like. And what we argue and what we found is that part of it is we talk about this, right? So, we talk about it at the dinner table, and we have talked about it at the dinner table, and really having those conversations to reframe those sort of scary moments so that they're not so scary. Interestingly enough, my mom, who I think you supported, she was a narrative therapist, and she worked with children at the end of her career. And part of what she did in her work was to try to empower children in their storytelling to have a more expansive view of the situation, in which they were experiencing, so that they weren't sort of externalizing like, I'm bad or I'm not good at something. And we can see that working in similar ways around sort of care recipients. Interestingly enough, my own work with my mom around death and dying was around restoring end-of-life experiences that we had together when I was a child. So when my grandfather died, we were all present. That was a sudden death. And remembering that and talking through those stories of our childhood experiences and telling those stories in the family context, right? So that this happened to us. This is something that we've gone through, and how did we deal with it, right? So yeah, my kid and my own experiences storytelling is a way to navigate conflicting values and sets of codes, and they live in the stories. And they live in the, intercultural kids or third culture kids often live in contradiction. But narrative can be a great way, and narrative therapy is a great way to help kids tell a story that's much more expansive of all the different things